Harari. Take a generation that remembers WHL life, was real like is ending. Have you ever sat with an elderly person and listened, truly listened, not politely waiting for your turn to speak, but actually absorbing what they were describing, and felt a quiet vertigo at the realization that the world they were telling you about was not merely older than your own experience, but genuinely, structurally different? From it, a world where you did not know what your friends were doing unless you physically went to find them. A world where being unreachable was the default condition of human existence rather than an unusual and slightly suspicious choice. A world where the opinions of strangers in distant cities held no power over your emotional state because you simply had no mechanism for receiving them. A world where boredom was not an emergency to be immediately solved with a device, but simply a weather condition of daily life that passed on its own. That world is not ancient history. For hundreds of millions of people alive today, it is personal memory. But the generation that holds those memories in living experience is ending. And when it is gone, something will be lost that no archive, no documentary, no digital preservation project can fully replace. Yuval Noah Harari has observed that we are living through one of the most profound generational transitions in the history of our species. Not merely a transition in technology or politics or economics, though all of those are happening simultaneously and at accelerating speed, but a transition in something deeper and more difficult to name. A transition in the baseline of human experience, in what people consider normal, in what the human nervous system has been shaped by, in what memories form the background against which the present is compared and evaluated. The generation now passing from the world is the last generation that knew, from direct personal experience, what human life felt like before the digital transformation fundamentally altered the architecture of consciousness, attention, relationship, and identity. When they are gone, the comparison will no longer be available in lived form. The before will exist only in description. And description, however careful, is never the same as memory. To understand why this matters, we need to think carefully about what memory does that mere information cannot. When an elderly person tells you that they used to spend entire afternoons doing nothing in particular, just sitting, walking, watching the light change, they are not merely communicating a fact about how time was spent in an earlier era. They are carrying in their nervous system, in the felt sense of their own experience, a kind of knowledge about the texture of unhurried time that people who have grown up in the age of constant connectivity may never fully possess. They know not just intellectually, but somatically, in their bodies, in their emotional reflexes, what it is like to be a human being who is not perpetually stimulated, monitored, connected, quantified, and optimized. That knowledge is a form of orientation. It provides a point of reference from which to assess what has been gained and what has been lost in the transition we are all living through. When that generation is gone, that point of reference disappears with them. Consider how dramatically the baseline of normal has shifted even within a single human lifetime. A person born in the mid-20th century grew up in a world where privacy was the natural condition of daily life, not a setting you had to configure or a right you had to actively defend, but simply the default state of being a person going about their business. Your thoughts were private because there was no mechanism for them to become otherwise. Your whereabouts were private because tracking location required physical effort. Your social interactions were private because there was no platform recording, archiving, and algorithmically analyzing the pattern of your relationships. Your emotional states were private because no device was monitoring your heart rate, your sleep, your movement, and feeding that biometric data into systems designed to infer your psychological condition. Privacy was not something this generation had to fight for. It was something they simply inhabited, the way you inhabit the air you breathe, without thinking about it, without knowing that it is a condition that could be otherwise. Now consider a person born in the first decade of this century. They have grown up with smartphones as a constant presence from early childhood. Their social lives have been shaped from adolescence by platforms that record every interaction, quantify every relationship through metrics of likes and followers, and provide a continuous stream of comparison with the curated highlight reels of hundreds or thousands of peers. They have never navigated social difficulty without the option of immediate digital escape. They have never spent a long afternoon genuinely bored, with no device to reach for and no content to consume, because the devices have always been there. They have never experienced the particular quality of anticipation that comes from not knowing, not being able to know what a friend is doing or thinking until you physically cross the distance between you. They have never sent a letter and waited days or weeks for a reply, sitting with uncertainty in a way that required a different relationship with time and with the unknown than anything the instant communication age produces. They are not worse people for these differences, but they are differently shaped people. And the shaping began so early, so pervasively, that it may be genuinely difficult for them to imagine the alternative from the inside. This is what Harari means when he speaks of the generation that remembers what life was really like. He is not romanticizing the past or suggesting that earlier eras were simply better. The mid-20th century carried its own profound injustices, its own forms of suffering and limitation that no reasonable person would wish to restore. Life before modern medicine was shorter and more painful. Life before the expansion of civil rights was defined by exclusions and violences that destroyed the potential of millions of people. Life before the digital revolution included forms of isolation, ignorance, and inaccessibility that caused real and unnecessary human suffering. Harari is not arguing that we should return to an imagined golden age. He is arguing something more precise and more philosophically interesting. He is arguing that the generation which holds in living memory the direct experience of the world before the transformation is uniquely positioned to see what the transformation has actually done, to identify not only what has been gained but what has been traded away, often without anyone explicitly deciding the trade was worth making. Each major technological transformation in human history has involved gains and losses that were not always visible to the people living through them. The people who adopted settled agricultural life from nomadic hunter-gatherer existence gained food security and the ability to support larger populations. But they lost something too: mobility, variety of diet, a different relationship with the natural world, and arguably, according to some historical anthropologists, a certain quality of freedom and physical well-being that the farming life could not match. But those losses were not legible to most of the people making the transition, because you cannot easily mourn the loss of something you are in the process of leaving behind, something you can still partially remember, but whose full value you may only recognize once the conditions that made it possible are gone. It is the generation that straddles the transition, that has known both sides, that is best positioned to identify what the shift has actually cost. We are living through precisely such a transition now, and the generation that straddles it is the last one with direct embodied experience of the before. They remember what it felt like to be unreachable. They remember what sustained attention felt like. The particular quality of absorption in a book or a conversation or a piece of music that fills the entire field of consciousness rather than competing for attention with the pull of a notification. They remember what it felt like to meet someone new without the option of immediately looking them up, without the ability to pre-construct a detailed picture of who they are before actually encountering them as a living, surprising, unpredictable person. They remember what it felt like to disagree with someone without being able to instantly mobilize a global audience of strangers to validate your position and condemn your opponent. They remember what it felt like to be wrong about a fact and simply remain wrong, without the ability to resolve every uncertainty immediately with a search, living for days or weeks with a question that had no accessible answer, which produced a different relationship with knowledge and with uncertainty than the age of instant information creates. These are not trivial memories. They are the record of a different cognitive and emotional ecology, one in which the human nervous system developed in a significantly different relationship with time, attention, uncertainty, privacy, and social connection than the ecology that now shapes the development of children who have never known anything else. The question Harari is implicitly raising is whether the losses embedded in this transition are visible enough, named clearly enough, and taken seriously enough in our collective deliberations about where technology is taking us and whether we want to go there. His concern is that they are not, that the generation whose memories could anchor that assessment is departing, and that once they are gone, the losses will become invisible, not because they cease to exist, but because there will be no one left whose personal experience provides a living contrast. There is a particular danger in the invisibility of lost baselines. when the conditions of life change slowly across generations, each generation tends to experience the conditions it was born into as natural, as the way things simply are, rather than as one possible arrangement among many. Children born into a world of total connectivity and constant surveillance experience those conditions as the normal human condition, not as a historically specific and relatively recent departure from a different norm. This normalization is not a failure of intelligence or imagination. It is simply how human beings calibrate their sense of what is natural and what is possible based on the conditions of their actual experience. But it means that each new generation inherits a narrower set of reference points for what human life can be like, and therefore a diminished capacity to recognize the alternatives that have been foreclosed. The implications of this narrowing extend well beyond the realm of personal nostalgia. The ability to recognize that the present arrangement of things is a choice rather than an inevitability, that it could be otherwise, is one of the foundational conditions of political agency and social imagination. If people cannot conceive that a world without total digital surveillance is possible, because they have never experienced one, they are less equipped to demand privacy as a right rather than a privilege. If people cannot conceive of sustained, uninterrupted attention as a natural human capacity, because they have grown up in an environment engineered to fragment it, they may accept a shallower form of consciousness as simply what it means to be human. If people cannot conceive of social relationships that are not mediated, quantified, and publicly performed, because every significant relationship of their lives has taken place at least partly on digital platforms, they may accept a more surveilled and performance-driven form of intimacy as simply the nature of human connection. The generation that remembers otherwise holds, without necessarily knowing it, a form of political and cultural knowledge that is genuinely irreplaceable. Their memories are not merely sentimental. They are a form of evidence, experiential evidence, about the range of possible human experiences that the architecture of modern digital life is rapidly narrowing. When elderly people describe feeling calmer in a world without smartphones, feeling more present in conversations that were not competing with the possibility of other conversations happening simultaneously on the same device, feeling more trusting of information that arrived through sources that required more effort to access and therefore carried an implicit accountability that the frictionless spread of digital content they are not merely expressing personal preference. They are reporting observations from a natural experiment of historic scale, one in which the same species lived under two dramatically different informational and technological conditions, and produced meaningfully different patterns of attention, well-being, and social experience. Harari has also pointed toward a second dimension of this generational reckoning, one that extends beyond the personal and psychological into the realm of institutions and political culture. The generation that is ending is not only the last to remember life before digital technology. It is also, in many cases, the last generation to have been formed by the institutions of the 20th century in their full functioning form. Institutions of journalism that operated under norms of verification, editorial accountability, and a shared factual baseline that, however imperfectly maintained, provided a common informational foundation for democratic deliberation. Institutions of civic life that required physical presence, face-to-face negotiation, and the kind of slow, patient community building that produced durable forms of social trust. Institutions of education that prioritized the development of sustained attention, critical reading, and deep engagement with complex texts over the rapid processing of fragmented information. These institutions were not perfect. They carried their own forms of exclusion, bias, and corruption that we are right to have criticized and reformed. But they also embodied accumulated wisdom about how to sustain communities of shared meaning and collective decision-making across time. Many of these institutional forms are now under severe stress, partly as a consequence of the same technological transformation that has altered personal experience so profoundly. The economics of journalism have been disrupted by digital advertising in ways that have dramatically weakened the business model of accountability reporting. Civic institutions have struggled to compete with the immediacy and emotional intensity of digital platforms for the attention and participation of citizens. Educational institutions are contending with students whose attentional capacities have been shaped by environments so different from the traditional classroom that the basic premises of how learning happens are being called into question. The generation that built these institutions, that worked within them during their periods of greater strength, that understands from direct professional experience what they were designed to do and why, is passing from active participation in public life. And with them goes a form of institutional memory and institutional loyalty that is genuinely difficult to transmit through formal documentation alone. What can be done with this understanding? The first and perhaps most important thing is to take it seriously as a form of genuine knowledge rather than merely sentimental attachment to the past. The memories of the generation that straddles this transition are data. They are the most direct evidence available about what human life feels like under different technological conditions, and they deserve to be collected, listened to, and analyzed with the same rigor that we apply to other forms of evidence about human well-being. This is not primarily a job for historians, though historians have an important role to play. It is also a job for psychologists, for public health researchers, for sociologists, for educators, for policymakers, and for ordinary people who choose to have real conversations with the elders in their lives before those conversations are no longer possible. The second thing that can be done is to resist the cultural tendency to dismiss the discomfort of older generations with digital life as mere technophobia or generational stubbornness. When a person who grew up before smartphones describes feeling that something important has been lost in the quality of human attention and connection in the digital age, that description deserves to be engaged with seriously rather than explained away as the predictable complaint of someone unfamiliar with new things. Every generation in history has had members who resisted new technologies, and not every such resistance was wise or well-founded. But resistance and observation are not the same thing. A person who has experienced both sides of a fundamental transformation and who reports that something was lost in the transition is not necessarily resisting change. They may be performing the essential intellectual function of naming a cost that those who have only known the new condition are structurally unable to perceive. The third thing is perhaps the most difficult. It requires holding simultaneously the recognition that the world before the digital transformation is not coming back, and the recognition that the transformation has involved real costs that deserve to be taken seriously, mourned if necessary, and compensated for if possible. Nostalgia is not wisdom, but neither is the reflexive dismissal of loss in the name of progress. The wisest response to a profound technological transition is not to pretend that everything gained has come without cost, nor to pretend that the costs are so severe that progress itself must be rejected. It is to develop the clearest possible picture of both sides of the ledger, to name what has been lost with the same precision and honesty with which we celebrate what has been gained, and to use that honest accounting as the basis for making better choices about where we go from here. To appreciate the full weight of what is being lost, we must also consider what the digital transformation has done to the experience of solitude. The generation that is ending grew up understanding solitude as a natural, recurring condition of human life. You were alone regularly, not as a therapeutic practice you scheduled into your calendar, but simply as the default state between moments of social contact. You walked to the corner shop alone. You sat in a waiting room alone. You lay in bed before sleep in genuine quiet, with no screen, no audio, no incoming stimulation of any kind, just the thoughts that arrived of their own accord in the absence of external input. This regular, unscheduled solitude was not considered a problem to be solved. It was simply part of the rhythm of a human day. And in that solitude, something happened that is difficult to name precisely, but that those who experienced it consistently describe as important. Thoughts completed themselves. Emotions settled. The mind made connections between things it had encountered across the day, across the week, across a lifetime of accumulated experience. Insight arrived not because it was sought, but because there was finally enough quiet for it to surface. The generation growing up now has never known this kind of unscheduled solitude in the same way. The moment of potential aloneness is now almost always filled. The walk to the corner shop is accompanied by earphones delivering a podcast or a music stream curated by an algorithm. The waiting room is navigated with eyes fixed on a screen cycling through content. The moments before sleep are spent scrolling, watching, consuming, right up until exhaustion finally overrides the pull of the device. The solitude that previous generations inhabited as an ordinary condition of daily life has become, for many younger people, something that requires deliberate effort and feels vaguely uncomfortable when it arrives uninvited. Boredom, which was once the ordinary predecessor to daydreaming, to creative play, to the kind of unfocused mental wandering that often produces genuine insight, has been transformed into an emergency that the device in the pocket exists specifically to resolve. The neurological and psychological consequences of this transformation are only beginning to be studied rigorously, but early indications are significant. Research consistently finds that unstructured time, time without specific task, demands, or external stimulation, plays an important role in memory consolidation, creative problem solving, and the development of a stable sense of self. The default mode network of the brain, which activates precisely during periods of unfocused rest and mind wandering, appears to be central to the processes by which the brain integrates experience, constructs narrative identity, and generates imaginative thinking. A generation that rarely experiences genuine unstructured mental rest may develop differently in ways we do not yet fully understand, not worse in every respect, but differently, shaped by an informational and attentional ecology without historical precedent. There is also the question of what the ending of this generation means for our collective relationship with mortality itself. The people now passing from the world in large numbers grew up in an era when death was less systematically hidden from daily life than it has become in contemporary Western culture. In earlier decades of the 20th century, death more commonly occurred at home rather than in hospital settings invisible to family members. The bodies of the deceased were more regularly part of community ritual rather than immediately removed to professional facilities. Grief was more often performed publicly, within communities that shared and acknowledged loss together, rather than processed in private or expressed through the mediated and somewhat disembodied format of a social media post. This does not mean that death was better understood or that grief was healthier in earlier generations, but it does mean that more people had direct, unmediated experience of mortality as a concrete fact of human life rather than something that happened elsewhere, to other people, managed by professionals, and encountered primarily through screens. The generation that is ending carries in its lived experience a relationship with mortality that is becoming rarer. Many of its members have lost siblings, spouses, friends, and parents in ways that were immediate and present, that required them to sit with the reality of death without the buffer of distance and professional management. And that produced a kind of knowledge about the finitude of human life that shapes how time is valued, how relationships are prioritized, and how the ordinary moments of daily existence are experienced. Harari has argued in his writing that awareness of mortality has historically been one of the most powerful drivers of human meaning-making, of religion, of art, of the urgency with which human beings pursue love and connection and creative work. A culture that increasingly insulates itself from direct encounter with death may gradually lose some of that urgency, that sharpened appreciation for the preciousness of time that comes from genuinely knowing, not just intellectually acknowledging but viscerally feeling, that it is limited. We should also consider what is being lost in terms of the particular kind of patience that the generation ending developed as a consequence of living in a world where information and communication moved more slowly. Waiting was simply a more prominent feature of daily life. Waiting for letters to arrive. Waiting for film to be developed. Waiting for a phone call that could not be anticipated by a text announcing its imminent arrival. Waiting for news that would not break until tomorrow's newspaper. Waiting for a television program that aired on a specific day at a specific time and could not be paused or rewound. This waiting was not merely inconvenient. It developed in people who experienced it a particular capacity for suspended expectation, for holding questions open rather than immediately resolving them, for maintaining relationship and commitment across gaps of time and uncertainty that contemporary communication systems have largely eliminated. The people who wrote letters and then waited weeks for replies developed a different relationship with patience, with the durability of human connection, and with the experience of time than people whose every communication is answered instantly or not at all. These are not small or trivial differences. Patience, The capacity to sustain commitment and attention across time without immediate reward or confirmation is one of the foundational cognitive and emotional skills required for the most demanding and most valuable kinds of human endeavor. The deepest friendships require it. The most significant creative and intellectual projects require it. The maintenance of democratic institutions and civic commitments across time requires it. The cultivation of wisdom rather than merely the accumulation of information requires it. If the generation that developed patience as an ordinary consequence of living in a slower world is ending, and if the generation that follows it has been shaped from childhood by systems engineered to eliminate every moment of delay and every experience of uncertainty, then something more than a stylistic difference in communication habits is at stake. The generation that remembers what life was really like is ending. This is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. All generations end. Every human lifetime is a finite arc, and the passing of generations is the basic rhythm of historical time. But this particular generational passing is occurring at a moment when the memories being lost are uniquely valuable, when the experiential knowledge carried by people who have lived on both sides of one of history's most profound transformations is still available, still accessible in living conversation, still possible to listen to and learn from. That window is closing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, as the people who hold those memories in their living bodies grow older and eventually cease to be among us. What we do with the time that remains while that window is still open is a choice. We can let those memories recede unexamined, assuming that the present and the future are what matter, and that the past is merely the past. Or we can choose to listen with genuine attention and intellectual seriousness to what those memories contain, to treat the experiential knowledge of a transitional generation as the rare and irreplaceable resource it actually is, and to carry some of that knowledge forward into a future that will otherwise navigate by memory alone the transformation it is living through. The generation ending is the last to remember.